Hey everybody, so this video is the first in a series of short videos that describe the labs that we did in the first semester of the school year, and they will provide you the basis for doing well on the final in a couple weeks. So the first lab that we did this year was the 5 white powders lab. In this lab we used the power of observation to look at 5 white powders separately. And then when you added 3 different liquids to them, you observed what happened. And when I gave you 3 of the 5 white powders, you had to figure out which 3 were there. And so the main things was to learn is some things about lab safety, but also about the power of observation. So what is observation? It's about seeing what's evident in the data and to use all your senses to see what your experiment is telling you. So the senses you use are mostly in class are sight, right? And touch, and smell, and in theory you could use taste and hearing. So obviously the sight is the one that you're going to be using the most. You can only touch something in the lab if it's in a container, then you can touch the outside, but you should never touch the actual materials in the class. Because it was the first lab, I didn't worry about this so much because they were all household chemicals, except one of the liquids, which you had to be careful with. That was the iodine. Smell, you should do very carefully, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. There's a special technique you should use. You should never taste anything in a chemistry class, for hopefully obvious reasons. And that's why one big reason why we shouldn't have food in the classroom, so you don't mix chemicals with the food that you eat, but also that there's previous labs that have been done and we don't clean off the desks enough so that you could eat off them. So that's an important thing to consider. And hearing, though, maybe you hear something bubble, but you can also see that too. So it's not as important. So there are safe and appropriate ways to observe. And so, for example, we used a magnifying lens over here on the left, and we used that to distinguish between sugar and salt crystals. So hopefully when you did this lab, you looked at each of the powders closely, and you noticed that both sugar and salt had crystals, though the crystals were of different sizes. So when you got your unknown mixture of 3 of the 5 white powders, you would have noticed that if you had crystals, you could tell the difference between the sugar ones and the salt ones. And over here on the right, you see this guy showing you the safe and appropriate ways to waft chemicals towards your nose rather than just sticking your nose in it. So I play on this guy, and you can see that he's pushing the chemicals towards his nose without sticking his nose inside the test tube that he's holding. So a little bit hard to see from this angle, but you don't put the test tube in your nose, you put it further away from your nose, and then you're pushing the chemical towards your nose until you either smell something or don't, right? And in this case anyway, this technique is called wafting. And really, this was our first chance to see chemical reactions. So when you add iodine to cornstarch, which was one of the liquids and one of the solids, it turns black. And so a lot of people notice this when you first notice the first 5 white powders separately. And then vinegar and baking soda, a lot of you notice that one of the chemicals smelled like, one of the liquids smelled like vinegar. And then when you add that to baking soda, it bubbles. And the thing is that even though color change and bubbles are indicators of a chemical reaction, it's not always true. You could add a dye to water, and that wouldn't be a chemical reaction. That would be just a physical change. And you could boil water, and that would be turning liquid water into gaseous water, and that wouldn't be a chemical reaction either. That would be a physical change. So just because you see a color change or you see bubbles, it may be a suggestion or the possibility of a chemical change, but not actually one. So you'd have to do other tests in order to figure out what chemicals are being produced. So hopefully that was a good review for you for the first lab, the 5 white powders lab. Have a good day.